And once again, good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this collaboration with the Center for Disaster Philanthropy and the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the U.S. Small Business Administration on a conversation for funders on reforms for disaster assistance to help survivors recover faster. This webinar is being recorded. Closed captioning will be made available as well as a transcript that will be made available afterwards. And so if there's anything that you've missed or anything you'd like to share, you will be able to do so shortly after our webinar today. We are so excited that you can join us and want to encourage anyone that has questions to use the Q&A pod. So there is a pod where you can type your Q&A questions there, and we will respond to those in kind if we are unable to incorporate them into the presentation. And with that, I'd like to now pass it over to Tanya, who is with Center for Disaster Philanthropy, who is our co-host and one of our close partners for this webinar today.
Thank you, Marcus, and thanks to our federal partners at FEMA and SBA for co-organizing and hosting this webinar with us. When we saw the changes to individual assistance, we knew that it was going to be so important for all funders to have an understanding of what was happening, and so reached out and asked if we could set this up. And if you want to go to the next slide. We also were very fortunate to have a number of co-sponsors, and these are our philanthropic serving organizations, Council on Foundations, Funders Together to End Homelessness, Giving Compass, Philanthropy California and Philanthropy New York, the Funders Network, and United Philanthropy Forum. And just really appreciate them for reaching out to their members and ensuring we have as wide of an audience as possible. And close to 700 of you registered, and really appreciate that. And next slide. I just want to take a moment, since I have the stage, to talk a little bit about the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. We are in our 14th year, and we are also a philanthropic serving organization. So our goal is to help funders. We want to strengthen the ability of communities to withstand disasters and recover equitably, and have a focus really on that equity piece and making sure that long-term recovery, especially, which is something that we know gets ignored, has a focus from philanthropy. And I think the changes to individual assistance are really going to allow funders to move some of their dollars into that recovery space. We do our work through education, consulting, and grant making. And if you want to go to the next slide, the education is all free for folks to access. Our website is disasterphilanthropy.org. You are welcome to access that. There is a playbook for funders who are starting out. Our website has profiles of different disasters, has 101 type information. What is a tornado? What is a hurricane? How do you help LGBTQIA plus organizations after a disaster that might be different? We have a weekly blog you can sign up for that's disasters around the world and things we're reading and watching. We have our own webinar series, and we'll have a webinar next Thursday looking at extreme heat, a disaster that I think is going to affect us all as climate change starts to have more and more of an impact. Special reports that we publish, including our State of Disaster Philanthropy, that tracks how much giving is happening in our communities, in the disaster philanthropy funder community. And then our staff. We're about 26 strong and growing quickly, and welcome the opportunity to speak with anyone about their work and about their needs around disaster philanthropy. And Marcus, I'm going to throw it back to you. Thank you so much for everyone who joined us today.
Thank you very much, Tanya. And again, thank you all for joining us. As Tanya said, my name is Marcus Coleman. I am honored to serve as the director for the Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships at the Department of Homeland Security, one of several centers of the White House Office of Faith-Based Neighborhood Partnerships. And if you go to the next slide, I just want to set the stage a bit for kind of where we are as an agency and as a department, and as an administration. And I want to first start by setting the stage by saying thank you. Thank you not only to the Center for Disaster Philanthropy and all of the wonderful co-sponsors today, but thank you all that are joining this call and the communities that you're connected and represented to, because your leadership has mattered leading up to this moment to get to these reforms. When FEMA Administrator Deanne Criswell spoke about building an agency that our community and our nation needs and deserves, she was talking like moments like this reform. Some of you may not know that within 6 months of the administrator being sworn in and confirmed by the U.S. Senate, we made some substantial changes to individual assistance to expand options to accept documentation for air property owners. But we recognized and knew, with the feedback from literally, in some cases, hundreds and thousands of folks, that is not enough. The administrator has pushed her entire team, and we have worked really diligently to do three things alongside our community members, like the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, the National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters, community foundations, and disaster survivors. The first is to listen, and listen with the intent to act. Administrator Criswell has saw it fit that our agency maintains a posture of listening with the intent to act with and on behalf of those survivors and those people that are often leading in times of crisis. We have several stories that I have seen myself, and that she has continued to use as kind of her guide and compass for making sure that the full breadth and depth and scope of FEMA is leaning in the direction of helping people before, during, and after disasters. Learning is a constant mode for the agency as well. And we recognize with all humility that we are filled with thousands of people in this agency who were once disaster survivors themselves. And so being able to take the opportunity to learn from the lived experiences of, again, people impacted by disasters in real time, and people bringing their expertise to the disaster response and recovery landscape has been vital to making sure that we are applying, again, the right kind of tactics and methods to help lean towards helping people during and after disasters. And then, of course, doing what we can to act and sharing that information, which is what brings us here today, and is the reason why FEMA is so esteemed and honored and privileged to be with Center for Disaster Philanthropy and all of its partners for this particular webinar. There's a lot to share, but there's a lot to do. And so one of the things we wanted to make sure that we were doing to honor some of our commitments, to make sure that we are helping people before, during, and after disasters, as Tanya said, is providing some context on where we are with some of the disaster assistance changes that have been made by FEMA within our own scope. And then also we have our colleagues from the Small Business Administration on to talk about some of the changes they're making as well. This all builds up to the Biden-Harris administration's commitment to ensure that we are being as equitable as possible of our program delivery and our engagement. And we recognize and know that the leadership from community members matter, that the leadership from philanthropy matters, and that there's no way that FEMA can lead without leading alongside our non-government and philanthropic and private sector partners. And so this whole community all hands effort truly is a testament of public participation and action and what we can continue to do together. With that, it is my honor and privilege to introduce my esteemed colleague, one of our leaders in FEMA, who has brought her breadth and depth of lived experiences to this agency and continues to lead us through, again, a very significant and historical change. And she's going to give you all some context on what some of these changes may mean, particularly for funders and for people in the community that are looking to make investments, especially when disasters occur, where there's a presidential declaration for individual assistance. So Dr. Elizabeth Ash, we'll pass it over to you to talk about the reforms. And then from there, we'll hear from our colleagues at SBA. So Dr. Ash, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marcus. Good afternoon, everyone. As Marcus said, my name is Liz Ash, and I serve as the Deputy Director for the Individual Assistance Division here at FEMA. I'm incredibly excited and honored to be with you here today to share with you the incredible changes that we've started to make in individual assistance and how we can work together to make them even more impactful for disaster survivors. Next slide, please. As you know, FEMA's mission is to help people before, during, and after disasters. A lot of that times that means connecting with people on the worst days of their lives to understand what help they need and what we can do to help them. At its core, our program is designed to provide much needed relief to disaster survivors and jumpstart their recovery after a disaster. Across our FEMA regions, we talk to and interact with survivors whenever a disaster strikes. And we've heard their stories. We've heard their stories about how the individual assistance program has worked for them, and we've heard their stories about how the individual assistance program hasn't worked for them over the past decade or more. So up on the slide here, we're kind of demonstrating a timeline of feedback that we've asked for from survivors and that we've heard from our own staff, from state, local, tribal, territorial partners, and from people in the community, people working in philanthropic and voluntary organizations. We have heard that there are things that we can do to make things easier on disaster survivors. We've heard that some have had a really hard time accessing the program. We've heard from some that it's been complicated to navigate disaster recovery, both across our program and across programs provided by the whole federal government. And we've also heard that it can be really confusing in a time where a survivor is already traumatized to access these sometimes life-saving and hope-giving programs. So, as Marcus so eloquently put it, when Administrator Criswell came to office, she asked us to make sure we're doing everything we can to meet people where they are. On the bottom side of the screen here, you can see some of the actions that we've taken leading up to these regulation updates that I'm going to talk about in a minute. One of the most impactful was a sprint in 2021 where we changed the ownership and occupancy documentation requirements for disaster survivors, which has resulted in more than 150,000 disaster survivors being able to access our programs that weren't before these sprints. We've also made updates to the letters that we send out to disaster survivors, and from 2022 through disasters happening today, we're doing something called Enhanced Applicant Services, which is a outreach to disaster survivors in parts of communities where the community, the state, or the locality lets us know that there may be populations that need extra help in applying. We've also updated our disasterassistance.gov website to only ask survivors for the answers to questions that will directly relate to their recovery. If you didn't have a home damage, we won't ask you home damage questions. So that all leads us up to what we've done here that we're going to talk about today. We have made updates to our regulations. Next slide, please. This is the biggest update made to the individual assistance program in 20 years. This is a huge deal. We updated the program to remove barriers to assistance, to reach more survivors, and deliver assistance more quickly than ever before. Survivors in the future are going to be able to have less burden when applying for and receiving assistance, receive cash assistance in their times of greatest need to cover serious needs and displacement, and access assistance to meet their unique needs in a way that they haven't been able to before. So the changes that we're talking about here are in effect for disasters declared on or after March 22nd, 2024. That was about a week and a half ago. So any disaster declared from now on will have these new rules, these new regulations applied to them. Next slide, please. So this is really the meat of the presentation, and we will make this available for you if you would like to take it with you to be able to kind of reflect on after we talk today. We have broken the changes into three big categories. The first is to establish new benefits that provide flexible funding directly to survivors when they need it most, and that is early in the recovery process. We've cut red tape and we've expanded eligibility to reach more people to help them recover faster while building back stronger. And finally, we've simplified the application process to meet survivors' individual needs and meet people where they are. So I'm going to go through briefly each of these changes, And as I do, I would love for you to think about how these changes to the way that FEMA is delivering assistance can change how you think about the place where you want to help people after a disaster. So in the first category, establishing new benefits, that is really about getting flexible money to disaster survivors who have serious needs or are displaced. So this is early in a disaster. We're able to give $750 to every disaster for those people that have serious disaster cause needs. And displacement assistance is a new type of assistance that we'll be providing to disaster survivors that they can use for their immediate housing needs. These immediate housing needs are up to them, their choice. They can use them on a hotel. They can use them to compensate their loved ones for staying in their home. This is creating a new form of assistance between the disaster and when rental assistance becomes available, so survivors have flexibility to use these funds in a time where rental units aren't often online. In the second category, we are cutting red tape and expanding eligibility. And I have some partners from SBA on here. We worked with the SBA to no longer require a survivor to apply for a SBA loan before being considered for certain types of assistance. So one of the parts of the survivor experience that we have gotten a lot of help from voluntary organizations, state, local, tribal, territorial partners is in explaining to a disaster survivor the need to apply for SBA before getting more from FEMA. We want to change that and allow disaster survivors to be able to apply for FEMA and apply for SBA at the same time. We're going to be talking a little bit more about SBA later, so I will leave it there. The next one, we are going to be helping underinsured survivors. This may be a place where your organizations have helped in the past, where a survivor who receives an insurance payment for damage to their home, but that insurance payment isn't enough to cover what happened to them. FEMA may be able to help up to the amount of assistance that we can possibly provide to make that home safe and sanitary and functional. There still may be unmet needs for disaster survivors who are insured. We think this will help cover that gap of those that are underinsured, as in insurance affordability and availability is a challenge across the country right now. We're also expanding habitability criteria. So survivors, survivors who have a damage to their home or a pre-existing condition like a leaky roof. In the past, they were not able to completely fix the roof if a tree fell on part of it. We were only able to help with the part the tree fell on. However, with this habitability criteria change, we should be able to help the whole roof, because replacing the whole roof will make that house safe to live in. That may have been a place that we relied on your assistance for in the past. We're making accessibility improvements to help survivors with disabilities improve their living conditions by making their homes even more accessible than they were pre-disaster. So FEMA can pay for ramps, for example, for a home that was damaged by a disaster, even if the ramp was not present before the disaster and the disaster did not cause a disability. I'm sorry, I needed a sip of water. I'm trying to run through a lot of content here pretty quickly. We're also simplifying assistance for self-employed survivors. So a self-employed survivor will be able to access assistance for essential tools and equipment for their trade. So for example, if you are a self-employed photographer, you can show FEMA that you are self-employed, and we'll be able to help you repair or replace camera that was lost or damaged in a disaster. There's a few more. So we're expanding assistance for computing devices, meaning we're going to help people with computers other than just for educational or work purposes. So knowing that computer is oftentimes the lifeblood and the way that you communicate with the outside world, we're going to cover those. We're simplifying the application process through a number of barrier reduction measures, simplifying the process for appeals and temporary housing assistance applications, in addition to removing barriers for late applicants. A lot of these are about reducing the number of pieces of documentation you need to give us, or the amount of information you need to give us to substantiate that you have a need. Okay, next slide, please. So this slide, this will be the last slide that I talk about before I give you a pitch to please go give us comments in the Federal Register. So the new sequence of delivery for disasters declared on or after March 22nd is a little more simple than the previous sequence of delivery, where we had an off-ramp and then a on-ramp for small business administration for some survivors. Before you even get into the sequence of delivery, before you start the process and before the disaster, we recognize there's an affordable housing shortage in many communities in the United States. In a disaster, this housing shortage becomes even more acute, making scarce resources even more limited for survivors. So pre-disaster housing planning and a focus on bringing housing units back online quickly after a disaster can dramatically shorten recovery and get survivors back on their feet faster. So for the sequence of delivery, you can see that it starts with voluntary organizations for mass care and emergency assistance. This is the first step and very important, and it connects with survivors. So survivors go to places like local churches, shelters, places to get food. All of these are organized by folks like you on the phone. So thank you for everything that you do in the early and all stages of disaster recovery. So the next stage is really insurance, or sometimes you get insurance the same time you're seeking shelter. We know that our assistance is not a substitute for insurance and can't compensate for all disaster losses. So we work to ensure messaging. Survivors need to apply for their insurance companies if they're insured after disaster. Then it's time to register for assistance from FEMA. So we just talked about how we've been making strides and working to make the application process easier on disasterassistance.gov. You can also register for assistance by calling 1-800-61-FEMA or registering with someone that is working in the field in the area where there is a disaster. With the changes to the IA program, including the addition of displacement assistance and the standardization of serious needs assistance, survivors with serious disaster-caused needs and those that are displaced will receive flexible cash assistance to meet their immediate food, medical, and lodging needs early in an event in a standardized way, in a way that they haven't in the past. So that's one place where FEMA will be providing additional resources in a way that we haven't institutionalized prior to this change. With the changes to habitability, accessibility, and self-employed applicants, we're also going to be able to do more for disaster survivors in places where you or your organizations may have helped in the past, like a survivor who needs a ramp to be able to access their disaster-damaged home, or a survivor who has roof damaged by a tree that was leaky before the tree fell. Another place philanthropic and voluntary organizations have helped in the past is the overlap between FEMA and SBA, to explain that need to apply for SBA before you can receive some assistance from FEMA. With our changes to the sequence of delivery, we still need your help to communicate how important the SBA assistance can be to a disaster survivor's recovery process. Their loans are so much bigger than the assistance that we are able to provide within FEMA, and they also cover additional things such as mitigation. So that is something that we want to continue to emphasize as a critical option for disaster survivors. So you also play a really important role in recognizing and meeting the unmet needs of disaster survivors after FEMA has helped, and once SBA has helped, or in conjunction with SBA. One of the hardest parts of the disaster recovery process is finding a long-term housing solution for a lot of displaced populations. So with disaster case management and long-term recovery groups, we think that there can be a lot of help provided and a significant shortening of the recovery timeline for disaster survivors by pairing them with the options for aid across different parts of the community and the United States. So we really value partnerships with all of our faith-based, community-based organizations, voluntary agencies in the private sector, in addition to our federal family here. So thank you for everyone and what you do to help people when they need it most. Next slide, please. We will put this link into the chat, but before I go, I want to encourage you all to go to the Federal Register and comment on the IA regulatory updates if you have any feedback. We're accepting feedback through the Federal Register through July 22nd of this year, and we'll incorporate feedback that we get into our next version of our individual assistance program and policy guide. Now, there will be questions at the end. I see there's a couple things in the Q&A chat. But for now, I'm going to pass it back off to my friend and colleague, Mr. Marcus Goldman.
Dr. Ash, thank you very much. So 3 things I want to note for folks. Number 1, 20 years worth of rules and regulations changes done and implemented, but recognizing that that is not the end of the process. So number 2, we need your feedback. You have the link here. We will drop the link in the chat. This is an ongoing conversation. It is particularly important for us to hear from our philanthropic partners, our community foundation partners, those non-government organizations that also provide immediate cash assistance, short-term recovery, and are often positioning communities to try to lead their long-term recovery. So hearing from you still is really important. Though these rules are implemented, there's a lot more that still needs to be done, and there's a lot more that we have to learn about making sure that we continue to increase the access and reduce the barriers for people getting the assistance that they need to jumpstart their recovery, which brings me to point 3. FEMA's assistance is a part of the puzzle still. What's not changed, first and best source of assistance is going to come from your insurance. It's going to come from some of the things that you access pre-disaster. FEMA is going to be a part of that puzzle to jumpstart the recovery. We recognize and know that FEMA may not always be the first thing that jumpstarted, but we may be an important part of the equation, especially and definitely if there's a presidentially declared disaster for individual assistance that is approved after March 22nd. And so with that, we're going to transition to our other partner that is a key collaborator with philanthropy, with non-government organizations, and that is under the leadership of Administrator Isabella Guzman, who has been equally committed to ensuring that the Small Business Administration is leading whole community efforts to get it right in support of people, households, and businesses that are impacted by disasters. I want to pass it over to my friend and colleague, Warren Miller, and his colleague, Eric Wall, who will walk us through a presentation on some of the updates that they are making in support of disaster recovery information that's important for funders to know about. Warren, over to you, sir.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can, sir.
Okay, good. Well, first I want to say thank you to Marcus and Tanya for the invitation for SBA to have the opportunity to share. There are a lot of friends that we've had the privilege to serve with over the years in this space, and this is an important time. I'm honored as an appointee to serve under, as Marcus mentioned, our 27th administrator, Ms. Isabella Guzman, who is a member of President Biden's cabinet and a voice for the 33 million small businesses that play a vital role across this nation. Next slide, please. So when disasters happen, as many know, when they're declared, SBA and FEMA have been aligned. One of the unique things that, as Marcus and our colleagues were alluding to, is the disaster loan program over the years has extended billions of dollars in low interest, long-term disaster loans to homeowners, to renters, to businesses, as well as nonprofits, i.e., our faith community, to be able to fully recover with disaster caused efforts. The other elements that we are looking at now are opportunities with small businesses with economic injury, that is working capital that can help those businesses, as well as equipment, machinery, personal property for renters. And Eric will talk a little bit more about where the focus of many of the dollars with regards to disaster loans that SBA extends. Next slide, please. So I'll share a couple of things that I want to focus on. The SBA, one of the things that I went over and started about 2 years ago, which we were going through reimagining. For those who were familiar with early days, it was recognized as the Office of Disaster Assistance. We have gone through organizational change, and now we are recognized as the Office of Disaster Recovery and Resilience. Changing our posture and approach, we're getting away from, it used to be just go into the community, set up disaster, participate in disaster recovery centers, extend a couple of loans and lead those communities. In some of the adjustments that we're making, we're now focusing on resilience, as well as the importance of mitigation and the things that will attribute to those businesses recovering from disasters. We are recently following the guidance of our administrator. This administration, you may have heard the theme that the Biden-Harris administration has been talking about, the whole of government, with regards to what the different federal partners bring, that we have gone and looked at, and the posture of within the SBA, we have established new policy when we have major declared disasters of the whole of SBA. With that, the coordination is being led by the Office of Disaster Recovery and Resilience, bringing in the guidance of the many agencies that those who have seen us in the disaster recovery centers never had the opportunity to engage with our government contracting group, our economic development, our women business center, our small business development centers. So now when these disasters are happening, we're bringing the whole of SBA of what is it on the front end, what is it as the immediacy, and in the long-term recovery that we as an agency can bring those tools and those resources to the benefit of survivors that were impacted. One of the other things that we've just done recently was increase our lending amounts. We have, as mentioned, the 30-year or 15-year long-term low interest rates. Right now, for homeowners, for those, they could have interest rates at 2.68%. Now, these are quarterly and they get looked at, but businesses at 4%, nonprofit organizations at 3.25%. The loan limits, as mentioned, the terms of up to taking at those low interest rates, the amounts. As I mentioned to you, billions of dollars. Our loan amounts were increased for homeowners. It was prior to July at $200,000. We recognize that around the country, the cost of material and the cost of labor and things like that has increased, and therefore, through some of the agency adjustments, those amounts were increased to $500,000 to assist with the repair and replacement of primary residents that may have been impacted by a disaster. For renters, those amounts previously were up to $40,000. That amount have now been increased to up to $100,000. Eric will talk a little bit about our mitigation piece and some of the activities and efforts there. But the other one that I wanted to, from a functional standpoint, as we talk about the individual assistance, there are other investments that we're making. There are some tools that we've recently invested in, recognized as portable loan outreach centers, which allow for us to be able to lean forward and go into the community. There'll be areas that may be a transportation challenge that people can't get to a disaster recovery center to do an application. They may have technical challenges with being able to get technology or internet access, that we have these tools that we're able to take and establish our portable loan outreach centers into the community that can help bring our resources to those survivors that may be those underserved and marginalized communities that may not be able to get access to those things by way of going to a disaster recovery center. With that, I'd like to yield to my colleague, Eric Walls, who I work with to share on a couple of the other things you see on the slide.
Thanks, Warren. Much appreciated. As Warren and Marcus and Liz mentioned, we are but a piece in the puzzle of the recovery mission and recovery space. SBA follows on with FEMA presidential disaster declarations, but we also have about 400 declarations that we make on our own outside of the presidential process. One such of those is a disaster assistance for rural communities. In December of 2022, the president signed a piece of bipartisan legislation called the Disaster Assistance for Rural Communities Act, where in the past we've had a threshold of 25 damaged structures. Now we just have one damaged structure threshold for a rural community. So far, we've made, I think, 15 of those declarations since those regs were issued in July of last year, and more to come on those. But that piece of legislation allows us to hit those communities that normally would fall through the cracks, that would have damages, but would not be consolidated like in a city or a small town would be. It would be more of a farming community or a community that has more spread land or spread structures across the land. Another reg change that we made at SBA in July of last year, like Warren mentioned, was the increase of our loan limits. This had been 30 years coming. We hadn't made changes to these limits in 30 years, unbelievably. It went from 200,000 to 500,000 in the circumstances that Warren mentioned. So for homeowners, real estate, for renters, that went from 40 to 100,000, like Warren mentioned. And then for businesses as a whole, those changes also were made. So now both businesses and homeowners are able to get up to $2 million. So while FEMA's providing that cash assistance up to, I think it's somewhere in the 40s or $50,000 nowadays, some homeowners, that may be, only a partial amount of what their need is. So like Liz mentioned earlier, it's $42,500. Thank you. So if somebody has hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of the real estate loss, or they're a renter and they have more than that $42,000 of personal property loss, we fill in that extra gap where FEMA may not be able to provide that additional assistance to those homeowners, renters, or even businesses. I always like to say that even though we are the Small Business Administration, during periods of disaster, 90% of our outgoing dollars are to homeowners. And that's always an interesting stat, because I know we're called the SBA. We provide a lot of assistance to businesses, but 90% goes to homeowners. So there's always a place for us whenever there's a major presidential disaster declaration. And the final piece that I wanted to mention before I turn it back over to Warren and Marcus is that we have modified in addition to the sequence of delivery, we are now pushing a little bit harder to make declarations faster. So in the past, local emergency managers or tribal communities have had to wait for a decision to be made from the presidential process. But now we are pushing forward. We're going to go ahead and start to make declarations, even if the appeal process is still in place, or even if an initial decision hasn't been made, to some of those communities that we think are better fit for SBA. We've done some of the math and the background to determine what we think is those candidates for those types of declarations, but we've made a couple of these recently, whereas the local community has been waiting for the presidential process to play out, but they still have those business owners that may not play in that space anyways. And so because of that, we have this gap that we need to fill, and we are now pushing the limits to make declarations much quicker. And these are those small agency declarations, not the large presidential ones, right? We follow on those, but those agency declarations or those rural declarations where we're the likely candidate to provide that declaration and provide that assistance to businesses in particular and some homeowners. We're go ahead and pushing forward on those. So the final piece was what's the mitigation piece. We made a change to our regulation last July as well. We removed one word from our regs, and that's the word similar. And by removing that one word from our regs, we no longer have to provide the same type of mitigation assistance that a person may have had damage for. Now we would provide mitigation assistance for any type of damage. So, for instance, if you had fire damage, you were in need of some flood mitigation project, we wouldn't fund that in the past. But now, because we've changed that one word similar, we're able to make that additional mitigation project allowable. It's permissible. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Warren for any final words before we turn it over to Marcus. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And I'll just, on the last one, which was a learning piece for me when I first got over to SBA, was just looking at if an individual was to go out and apply for a loan. I mean, there are things with regards to relocation, the consideration that what if they had a $10,000 deductible that they could look at applying for this loan and embed that deductible that they may not have that amount. So these are some of the flexibility things that with SBA, working with our partners with FEMA, and we recognize this new sequence. We're going to be relying upon people to help us with educating the public and urging for them of how we together are working toward helping them with recovery solutions. So with that, Marcus and Tanya, good. Again, I want to thank everyone for the opportunity to join. You see the information we have there. We'll take some questions a little bit later on. And at this particular time, Marcus, we'll hand it back to you, sir. Thank you all. Good day.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Warren and Eric. And again, y'all, I want to paraphrase three things that I think a lot of people are often surprised about. Yes, it is called the U.S. Business and Small Business Administration, but their support for disaster recovery and resilience are for homeowners, for renters, for private nonprofit organizations, and for businesses of all size. The Small Business Administration is a key collaborator and partner. I know people that have been impacted by disasters know this, but especially for our funders, we want you to have a good relationship with FEMA and your state local emergency manager, but it's also important to make sure that you have that open line of communication with Small Business Administration. Second point that they noticed in terms of some of their reforms and some of their reg changes, that they are looking at ways that the loans can be used more flexible for hazard mitigation. That information has been dropped in the chat for you to access, as long as all of the information for SBA Disaster Response, Recovery, and Resilience. We have been answering some of the questions in real time in the chat, so please keep your questions coming there. But I want to actually pose two questions. First, we'll start with Liz and Christina, and this is about question of advice, particularly for those community foundations or some of those national organizations or funders that are looking to start a conversation with their state emergency manager or county emergency manager. What advice would you have for them today in terms of just where they may want to start introductory conversations, or maybe they've worked together in the past and now they're going to leave this webinar and go back to their state and local emergency manager? Dr. Ash, I know you've talked to a lot of our emergency management community about this for sure, but would be open to any advice or things that you have thought about in terms of what kind of conversations funders should be having in the non-government context with government agencies. Recognizing, right, it's not just FEMA funding, it's not just SBA funding. There's a lot of different resources. So any advice you have, Dr. Ash, on maybe where they would want to start a conversation based on some of these changes?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am in recovery, and I'm a mitigator at heart. So as I mentioned at the top of the sequence of delivery slide, I think one of the biggest challenges we have after a disaster is the exacerbation of this affordable housing crisis that we have before the disaster. So where are the conversations that you can engage in about what are we going to do when, rather than after something has already happened, right? How are we thinking about our most vulnerable populations? the most vulnerable populations that sometimes end up in temporary housing for FEMA for an extended period of time. How are we easing the handoff between organizations in the federal government, in the nonprofit space, back into their recovery, and really shortening that window from the event to the person has a new start after that event. So I would say think about what's going to happen in a disaster before the disaster happens, especially focusing on that housing stock and that availability for the folks that need it the most. Christina, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Nothing to add.
Awesome. Thank you. And Warren, similarly for you, sir. So I know that you're currently senior advisor in SBA, but you bring a long storied history as a nonprofit executive, a leader in the private sector, and an emergency manager at yourself at what point. What advice do you have for funders in terms of bringing together different government partners about what they should be talking about today, while we still have in some communities blue skies? So we'd love any advice that you have for funders about where to start that conversation now.
Well, recognizing that government is not going to have all of the solution and the resources, the most important immediacy is that things start locally. Recognizing we have the history of looking at understanding the areas that have risk and things like that, about what kind of resources are going to be needed, especially in some of these underserved communities. Realizing that there will be needs for investment in the volunteer partners, in resources for people that have gaps, to help move those things forward with regards to that community recovery. So blue sky right now, I think when bad things happen and when the declaration comes, the federal government is going to go and be there, but understanding that there are going to be needs for the important resources that you all as funders can make available in these communities to fill those gaps for the things that if they get a grant and they need additional dollars, if they don't apply for the loan. So recognizing the opportunities and the important role that you'll play in those particular communities.
Thank you for that, Warren. There again, continue to ask your questions in the chat. I actually want to call up my friend Tanya to address a question from a friend and someone I'm a fan of that's been doing great work in the philanthropic space, Brooke Campbell. So Tanya, Brooke raised an important question as we think about particularly digital access and accessing information in light of the digital divide that leaves many people who would qualify for these resources, right? There may be some technology gaps we take for granted and privilege. Not everybody has a cell phone, not everybody has cell service, access to internet. So Tanya, I know that you've been working with a lot of partners on different kind of questions and issues related to this. Would love to hear anything that you'd like to offer in response to Brooke's question.
Thanks, Marcus. And I suspect this may come up as well in the funders panel. This is really an area where community foundations and funders can invest. We have a lot of corporations, for example, that are skilled, that work with computers all day, that have access to computers. And that's an area where they could loan out some staff to go into a community center or a neighborhood center and help people with the applications. And then, funding more computers in those places, in libraries, in community centers, in places that people access, especially folks who don't speak English as their first language. And then the other thing is to remember that FEMA has lots of resources to help people with the applications as well. There is a phone number. You can do this application by phone. And so I don't have it off the top of my head like Dr. Ash does, but I'm sure she can put it in the chat for us. So if you have access to that phone, you don't have to know how to use the computer. And there are a lot of government programs to get people very cheap cell phones. And so usually that is something they have access to, even if they don't have internet access. And I live in a city where over 25% don't have internet access. So I understand that barrier. And as Dr. Ash said very early on, if you see a FEMA representative or a government rep in the community, you can also ask for assistance. And I know for folks who are undocumented or who are new immigrants and refugees, approaching federal assistance partners may feel scary. And that's okay. And that's where I think funders have that ability to help train people in FEMA assistance. Our friends at SBP have done a lot of work around FEMA and training community members on how to fill out the FEMA forms and the applications. And that's another place where our community funders can get involved in helping address that issue.
Thank you very much, Tanya. And so some things to note. One, again, Center for Disaster Philanthropy, through all of their resources, the webinars, the Disaster Philanthropy Playbook, I'd say the way that they approach just the convening of partners is going to continue to be key and vital for us. And so we want to thank Center for Disaster Philanthropy again and all of the co-sponsors for the opportunity for us to bring, again, some federal perspective to the table in terms of where we are continuing to make changes for disaster recovery. We are now going to transition to my friend Sally Ray, who will help moderate the next panel from a philanthropic perspective. And so more than happy to answer any other additional questions that folks may have on the federal programs. Again, in that Q&A pod, we'll do our best to get to as many questions as possible live, but please also leave your questions in there because that's going to inform ways that we continue to engage and adjust our messaging moving forward. So again, thank you all very much for allowing us to come alongside Center for Disaster Philanthropy and all of the wonderful co-sponsors, Sally, Ray, and Tanya. And Sally, I'll pass it over to you to lead the funders panel.
Thanks so much, Marcus, and for joining us and allowing us to use your knowledge and the knowledge of your colleagues at FEMA and SBA to share with our funder community. I'm Sally Ray, as Marcus said, and I'm the Director of Domestic Funds at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I have nearly 30 years of experience. Oh, that scares me when I say that. Working in the nonprofit world and a passion for community and social service. Before my current role at CDP, I was the Director of Strategic Initiative, and before that, I was the Hurricane Harvey Recovery Fund Director. So I've been with CDP for a little over 6.5 years. I currently oversee the grant making for several domestic disaster funds. And as Tanya mentioned, CDP is the only full-time resource in the world dedicated to educating donors about disaster philanthropy. And as such, we really thought it was important that we make sure that funders were aware of these changes to individual assistance that FEMA and SBA are now implementing. IA is such an important part of disaster response and helps individuals recover from the effects of disasters. And the role of funders largely remains the same with these changes, but the implications to our communities and the timing of our responses might be a little bit different. Thank you again to our government partners for providing information about these changes and in doing so openly and honestly. Since we know that funders also like to hear from funders, I am pleased to have a couple of representatives of that community and community foundations and corporate funders with me to discuss the impact of the changes to their work. Abe Diaz is the Principal Technical Product Manager for Disaster Relief by Amazon. By offering logistic assistance, technical resources, and teams of volunteers, Amazon is committed to providing post-disaster relief in areas where customers and employees live and work. Abe describes himself as a technical evangelist and community builder and has several years of experience delivering software solutions and influencing change. In 2017, Abe had the chance to participate as a technical volunteer in filling a plane with relief items for Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. He says that being able to mobilize the technology, people, and resources of Amazon for a cause like this was the experience of a lifetime, and it led to him joining the Disaster Relief by Amazon team. And Carrie Walker is the Director of Learning at the Greater Cedar Rapids Community Foundation. Carrie is a nonprofit leader who believes that facilitating connection creates a stronger nonprofit community. She has over 15 years of nonprofit work experience, along with serving as a volunteer in a variety of roles. Carrie oversees the nonprofit network of the Greater Cedar Rapids Community Foundation and has been part of the internal disaster philanthropy and grant making team since 2018 and filled various roles during the response and recovery of the 2020 pandemic and widespread derecho in her community. She currently serves as the chair of the Lynn Area Partners Active in Disaster Lab Aid, the local collaboration of more than 40 organizations active in disaster recovery and response. Terry, I want to start with you. FEMA has tried to remove some of the immediate barriers people face after a disaster. What are people thinking about in the first few days after they've been affected by a disaster event?
Yeah, thanks again for having me. And for those of you that aren't familiar with Cedar Rapids, we are in eastern Iowa. So we are the largest city in eastern Iowa. And so to your question, what are people thinking about? It is a very overwhelming experience to be part of a disaster. And I will just speak directly to the 2020 derecho that we had, which was unexpected. And so we thought we were having a storm that was going to have some high winds, and we ended up having an inland hurricane in a place where we don't have that kind of weather usually. And sustained winds for that length of time, it's very overwhelming, and it caused a lot of damage, and it made everything very difficult. So I think this is where you start to see kind of where everyone is starting and where the inequities begin right away after a disaster, because where we're at during a disaster is then reflected on how we can recover. And I will just speak to more of the mental the mental effort it takes to get through that survival mode in that first, especially 24 hours of no access to electricity, limited access to ice and gas and things that are necessary maybe to keep up the things that you have in your household, major damage to homes, difficult travel, no internet access, and very limited cell service. And so just the reality of that as that sets in is just a really, really mentally draining process.
Abe, let me go to you next. In the planning call that we had, you said that sometimes people don't apply because they don't think they're going to get anything. How do you think maybe these process changes from FEMA affect this expectation now?
Initially, they won't. It's gonna take some time. But I think us as a coalition, we have the opportunity to increase education, increase tech literacy and programming to clarify those changes. But we still will have some gaps. I think the work of great partners like CDP, like SBA, and others like SBP USA will be key in this. And as Tanya said earlier, I think having humans that look and speak the languages of the communities that need, it's going to be a great example for like lowering the fear in access to those resources.
I agree, absolutely. As we've heard from FEMA, they have expanded eligibility, so there may be more folks who can receive at least some level of FEMA funding, and this should reduce the amount of urgent emergency assistance required a little bit, freeing up funders to cover other areas, which we've often encouraged or have encouraged since our beginning at CDP. At the same time, though, I also understand that people will know faster what they are getting or not getting from FEMA. So the responses will come more quickly. This means they can begin planning their recovery with full awareness of resources available to them, or they'll be left without sufficient resources and may need more community support at an earlier point in time. Recovery begins faster, relief ends sooner. Carrie, after the derecho in Cedar Rapids during 2020, a lot of people were denied FEMA assistance, at least initially. What happened after that, and how might this new process have resulted in different outcomes for that?
Yeah, a few things I wrote down during the presentation, and I circled flexible funding and expanded eligibility. And what we found, and I talked to some of the leadership of our long-term recovery committee in preparation for our conversation today. And what they really relayed to me was that the process was confusing because people would receive their denial letter and they would just take that as the end and not look any further, maybe not even read it to understand that it said, oh, but you can apply for this, or you forgot this step, or you have to do this step. And so a lot of people just either gave up and just didn't proceed, or misunderstood, especially with the language of the Small Business Administration. They didn't understand that was applicable to them as an individual. And so that's really what the long-term recovery leadership and those that worked on our housing recovery program said, was that it was just, the cleaner language, the expanding eligibility, the simplifying the other needs assistance, like all of those things will be helpful to help reduce some of that confusion for the people that are either receiving letters or trying to communicate in a way that they're just not as comfortable. And I think that was the other thing, is that some of the personal stories were that I thought I did the forms wrong, or I didn't have access to a computer, or if you remember what was happening in 2020, I didn't want to be around other people. And so I didn't, because of the pandemic, so I didn't want to go ask for help, but I didn't know how to do it myself. So, some of those barriers, hopefully with some of the changes that I've seen that like I said, I underlined, will help some of them be able to access them more easily.
Yes, I know a lot of us have been advocating for changes like this for a while. So, bravo to FEMA and SBA for taking the steps. I know after 20 years of a process, these are maybe not huge steps to some of us, but they are big steps, y'all. So, and we've been advocating for them for quite a while. And hopefully this process will make everything easier, make it more accessible, lead to more approvals and potentially less need. But still, not everyone is going to get the maximum grant amount, and funders will still need to step up to help. Abe, what it may do is increase the time between response and recovery, which we've kind of hinted at a little bit here. What would that mean for a corporate funder such as Amazon, which is so involved in the immediate response?
It means we need to be even more nimble, have less restrictions on anything being funded in, and also just being really dynamic in the unmet needs for the community. For us, that means our relief product strategies might vary depending on the locations. In some communities, like we saw in Ian in Florida, just a couple of weeks after, they were already shifting to recovery indeed, and the products that they needed were very different. So like we had to be really mindful of not sending products that there's no demand for them very quickly, sort of like using our forecast and projection, being able to keep that second disaster of unwanted products in the community to a minimum, and just being, optimizing for like what is truly needed. So I think in Amazon speak, we call that, working backwards from the customer, and the customer is our community. So we need to do that more than ever now.
Carrie, a similar question for you. For a community foundation, or even for your COAD, what does a different timeline mean for you, since you're often involved in that long-term recovery phase?
Yeah, I think it means that the more we do to prepare ahead of time, the better off we are. I think we are a community that has experienced disaster before, so we're a step ahead, I would say. And then we're uniquely positioned in our community as a community foundation to help convene people. And so our role really is to do that ahead of the disaster and really reach out to communities. We've done that in a few different ways and tried to really engage people that we know are not traditionally included in the conversations. And all of those connections are really what makes our community recovery on a faster timeline than before. So that's really what our focus has been. The other thing is that we have had an amazing group of people and access to some resources and to connections that have helped us with some of those processes through the Funders Network and other partners that we've had. And so finding those resources and connections for community foundations and community funders, will continue to be critical. Also, it's not a role that all community foundations are familiar with. So just speaking in a big picture, we've been the unlucky ones to have several large disasters. And so it's something that we're familiar with and that we've engaged in. But, to be able to really send those resources and those connections to those that haven't yet, that we expect probably will at some point, is going to be one of the keys to recovery quicker.
Yeah, I mean, I think you highlighted there the critical role a place-based funder can play in sharing experience with others, with national funders, with groups like us at CDP, and with other community foundations that are experiencing what you've experienced. Carrie, I want to stay with you still. You had the standing COAD before the derecho happened. Why do you think it's important for communities to have a system in place before a disaster, and what role could a funder play in making that happen? You touched on it a little bit briefly, but I'd like for you to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think, the first part of the question, the importance is really the network that you've created. I think, back to some of the talk at the beginning of our time together today about the housing crisis and those types of things, a COAD serves in a way to address some of those equity concerns, even in blue skies. And so, having a network of people and organizations and governmental organizations and city representatives all in one space. We as a COAD meet on a quarterly basis. So having them in one space to really just kind of address what's going on right now, what do we need to learn from each other? I just think that's so beneficial, and it's so critical to having a unified view of what we can do together. And as we know, during that stressful time of disaster, like having a unified group that has connections already is just so important. And then the second part of that question is, what was the second part of that question? Oh, the role of the funder. Yes, I knew there was a second part because I said the first part. So the role of the funder, I think I said to it earlier, is that we can be conveners, and I'm especially community foundations. We're all different community foundations, but we all are community focused. So for us, we have relationships with nonprofits, we have relationships with community leaders, and we can serve as that convener, and then look at some of those other partners that we can bring in that can really help us do that preparation. We're just just in a unique position that we can really, and I feel like that's the role that we've served in our community.
Yeah, we at CDP say every funder is a disaster funder. So in your first part of your answer, when you were talking about the housing crisis and things like that, people need to recognize that if they're funding in housing or homelessness or education, healthcare, all of those areas are the things that are most affected by a disaster. And if you can build up the capacity in those areas for your community, then you've made your community a safer place. Abe, we know that people who are marginalized before a disaster are often most at risk after a disaster as well, which goes to my point previously. What do you think are some of the equity and access needs funders and the government need to consider as these changes are implemented?
I think nonprofit organizations and community organizations, they're going to need to refresh, upgrade, update their programming, and that means additional spend. So this means unrestricted funding is going to be needed more than ever to make sure that they're up to speed, up to date, and can react to the additional volume. And what that translates is into greater accessibility, equity and technology literacy hurdles that need to be lower, and that's investment in both technology and many more programming parts of it. Some nonprofits also are well positioned to help fill that gap A partner we work with in the past, for example, is like Off the Grid Missions, and they do incredible work with the CODA and hard of hearing community. It's like having the right organizations that understand those like micro communities, if you want to think about it that way, and providing the funding and the resources that they need. I think it's going to be critical for the volume to be absorbed. In addition, I think communities per se also like marginalized communities sadly are going to have to start looking into like creative ways to self-service in a way. And that means maybe looking at parametric disaster insurance, which is different from flood or fire or SBA loans, and other ways that, other tools that we haven't really looked into in the past, honestly, and funders being able to provide that, or if you want to think about it this way, as employers being able to provide some of those benefits. That's revolutionary if you think about it that way, but that's what the future looks like.
Right. Climate change. It is here, people. But following up on that, just a reminder that all of us listening have the opportunity to advocate for keeping these changes and additional changes, or drawing attention to issues that need to be attended to as FEMA develops additional guidelines. Breaking down the barriers is definitely an important one that we need to make sure continues, and more barriers are taken away. So please be sure and put your thoughts into the Federal Register. The link is in the chat for everyone. Terry, kind of a passion of ours at CDP, but also I know it's important for others on this call. Disaster case management is on the top of my mind. I think funders are going to have to be ready to get in that place faster than funds from the government may flow. As a community foundation, what would it mean to your response if we are going to have to do more of that type of service and faster than before?
Yeah, I think the focus on not working in silos. So back to that preparation, that if we're thinking about our housing programs and, having some of those things set up ahead of time in preparation will be really important for us as a funder working with our co-ed. And then I always go back to having relationships. I think, relationships with the organizations, with relationships with communities, so that we can help communities feel comfortable with the systems and processes that can come with the disaster, and engaging in those resources without fear or without hesitation, because they are familiar with the community and the systems that are in place, and the people and the relationships. So that's one of the things that we have done. I do think that faster, in terms of faster, I think that is also one of the funding concerns, is that do you have some funding that is available to you immediately that we can help not only with the immediate human needs that might come up, but also the immediate system needs of setting up that structure of do we have coordinators ready to help coordinate to assist in recovery. And so I think that those kind of systems things that for us, came a little bit later, maybe a couple months later, might come sooner than what we're used to. And so having some of those things available to us would be really important.
Right, exactly. Be prepared. I want to shift it back to Marcus in a minute to take questions from the audience, but I have one more question for you, Abe. The hurricane predictions are starting to roll out. We got some today, and I know you're following them quite carefully because you shared them with us earlier before we started this webinar. You were telling me that your experience last year, and you mentioned this a little bit ago, with Ian, showed that communities are maturing and understanding their own needs after a disaster. We've been through a lot of them. We know what we need. But the larger number of hurricanes predicted this year, or as COVID kind of showed us, communities may also face multiple challenges at the same time. So how do funders need to adjust when we think about overlapping the various phases of disaster or the need to respond to more than one at a time?
Yeah, and this is why I am excited and I welcome these changes, especially in individual assistance. But this changes nothing for funders. The needs are still there, and they're going to be much greater. But in essence, to your point, Sally, we're facing a time in history that we have not seen before. You might call it continuous response or perma-crisis. Many terms will come out of it. But in essence, it's a reality that we might have a specific community see two major events in quick succession from each other, or multiple events happening in a larger region. Many organizations have not had that level of demand and stress before. So for us is understanding that every ounce of preparation is going to be worth a pound of relief energy later on, right? And it will help recovery. So for us personally at Amazon, what we're trying to do is actually like investing like a considerable investments in that precise scenario and pre-positioning relief items and having things ready, being able to like deploy those very quickly for relief nonprofits that we're working with to reduce that time to delivery, because the more that we can reduce that time to delivery during relief, it means recovery can start faster. So I hope other funders will follow suit and see in other ways and how do I expand what they do, not just in relief, not just in recovery, but like on the fringes of both of those, and seeing how that spills over into preparation, to be honest with you.
Preparation and mitigation, those things are critical, especially as we consider that we're going to have could potentially have multiple events that affect the Gulf Coast this year, for sure. But I also would be remiss if I didn't put a plug in for those disasters that might not get a FEMA declaration or get a lot less attention from funders. That's a space we work in frequently at CDP. So be aware that in many cases, there's a devastating disaster to a community that doesn't get a FEMA declaration. It doesn't have access to IA. And even if it gets a FEMA declaration, it may not get an IA declaration. So our need as funders to be aware of that and to focus on those communities that have a lot less attention put on them in a disaster is going to be critical and become even more critical as we see climate disasters occur across in places where we hadn't seen them before. Okay, off my soapbox and back to you, Marcus, if you have some questions you'd like to ask or if there's some questions in the Q&A box.
I do, and that was a phenomenal discussion, and I appreciate that context. I think to just some key points I want to make sure to just reinforce for folks, right? We're hearing from a community foundation and we're hearing from a national philanthropic partner that are giving us some context that one, on the government side, we need to continue to be humble, right? We know and recognize that we are not the end all be all, and that there's a lot, as I mentioned at the beginning, to listen and learn. And I think they laid out some very tactical and practical considerations for funders. So question I have, actually, I want to start with Carrie, and it comes from an acronym that she used, and this is from our friend Mark Bolton. He wanted to know about community organizations active in disasters. Very familiar with voluntary organizations active in disasters. I know as a community foundation, you may engage with various co-ads. Would love to hear kind of a little more of your story on how you engage with those community organizations active in disasters and what funders may need to know or be interested to know about those groups.
Yeah, sure. Our co-ed was actually formed. We had a major flood in 2008. And so following that, the organizations that really worked on some of that recovery started meeting regularly and talking about how they can work together. So community organizations active in disaster really is our nonprofit and government infrastructure. And what services are we providing in the community, and how can we all work together to not only, not do duplicate services, but also be collaborative so that we can each provide our expertise in the recovery process. So we saw that really well in the housing program that came in after derecho. So, what our goal is to empower each of our organizations, and we do have government organizations, we have private businesses. So it's our, anyone in the community that's willing and able to provide access or or information or resources that can come together during those times. And so, like I said, we meet quarterly as a co-ed. We talk a lot about different trends that we're seeing. We do a lot of informative presentations about things that are going on in the community, like our Alliance for Equitable Housing, all of those types of things. It's just a great network for our community to be part of. And yeah, so I think that's, I don't know if there's any follow-up questions, I'd be happy to answer.
No, awesome. I appreciate that. And we did drop in the chat. So Center for Disaster Philanthropy does support in a lot of places and spaces. I know one of their other partners and collaborators is the Extension Disaster Education Network, who has developed an entire webpage committed to community organizations active in disasters. And Sally has also dropped for everyone. Those community organizations active in disasters are probably going to be the first set of team members for the long-term recovery groups that get established in communities. And so Disaster Philanthropy, Center for Disaster Philanthropy has done a lot of work and has a lot of already great existing webinars content. When we start talking about the Disaster Philanthropy Playbook, it ain't just for after, right? These are the kind of things that they think about beforehand as well. The last question I'll have before we close the webinar is actually to Abe. And Abe, this is a question for advice. So I want to put you on the spot for just giving some advice. We have some emergency managers on the call and probably some folks with government that are probably hearing these perspectives for the first time. This is very high level advice, but please be specific as you choose to be. What recommendations would you have for maybe a county emergency manager or state emergency manager in terms of just where to start conversations with private sector communities that do philanthropy or other philanthropic organizations? And then Carrie, if you want to chime in after Abe, that would be great as well.
That's a great question. I can speak to us, can't speak for everybody, but I would say if there's a local presence of that, partner, definitely start there. Some of the most impactful work that we have done, it's just grassroots, like our fulfillment center employees let us know, hey, this happened. We want to support it. My role is to empower them to support the community, but they know the needs, they're right there. So I would say if you had that local partner, reach out to them. If you don't have it because there's no presence or it just doesn't quite work out, I think a lot of times there's a great communication with, local mayors, local officials in them understanding and bubbling up to a lot of the, organizations that work in this space. And if not, then directly reach out. You'll be surprised. When you do reach out, my best advice is always to be very specific. Especially when it comes to us, Sally knows this, and Tanya knows this. Like sometimes we see requests, and it's like, we need diapers. How many? All of them. Like I don't think you understand. Like, when you say all of them to Amazon, you probably are going to be down in volumes, right? So like, be specific. We need this in this quantity in this location, and also understand that many of us are here for the long term, not just episodic. So say, this is what I need this week, and this is what we need next week, and here's how we're changing predictions. And that helps many of us to sort of shift our attention and energy in a way where it's best for the community, right? I don't want to send stuff that, what's needed last week. Like take your time. It's okay. Think about what the community needs, like be specific. So that's my one advice I always tell people. If you're specific and make it in a way that we can just say yes easily, you'll get a lot more yeses.
Carrie, any advice you have for maybe local or county emergency managers for community foundations?
I would just say create that relationship. I feel like we've done, a lot of work in the space of creating the relationships with our co-ed, with our emergency managers. And, they helped us out with the cohort that we did for inclusion. So, their openness to be part of some of the initiatives that we're working on has been crucial to making headway in making sure all of our community is included in the process and the connections that we know that they will need if a disaster occurs again. So I would just say, be open to working with each other and making progress on some of the things that your community might experience, and being aware of some of the things that your community might experience and working toward the preparation of those.
Awesome. So y'all, for emergency managers on the line, be specific, be open. Also, be connected. The Center for Disaster Philanthropy and all of its partners, right? When we think about all the co-hosts that have done this call, it reflects a broad coalition of philanthropic organizations looking to build those relationships. And again, there's a lot of stuff that's been made available. Tanya and Sally Ray, want to pass it to you for any final comments or words from Center for Disaster Philanthropy before we close out the webinar.
I'll jump in, but I will just say, first of all, thank you again, Marcus, to you and to our other federal partners. Thank you to Sally and Abe and Carrie. Thank you to our interpreters and our captioner. Appreciate making the webinar more accessible. And then thank you to all of you who have come to watch this. As Marcus said, please make sure that you take a time and look into these changes and then reach out. The comment period is still open. We need to know what changes will help you as funders, as organizations who are responding. We need to know how to make this as equitable and as accessible as possible. And I answered a couple of the questions in the chat about that, right? This is the time for you, if you're a person living with a disability, or if you speak languages other than English, to step up and to share your experience if you've been through a disaster, and especially the challenges you've had, so that FEMA and SBA and other federal organizations can make some changes. But really, thank you to FEMA, Marcus, especially you and your team, for helping us get this message out to funders and for making these changes. This is incredibly important and a really great resource for people.
Absolutely. Well, as we recognize and know, it is just a step. So Tanya and Sally Ray, thank you both for your leadership and just continued proactiveness and encouragement across a broad coalition of partners. I'd say my closing remarks is to remind everyone that when disasters and crises happen, we may often feel by ourselves, but we are never alone. And so there are literally hundreds of organizations partnering with organizations like Center for Disaster Philanthropy, Amazon Disaster Relief, community foundations, the National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters, and we are all pushing towards the same goal. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining the end of the webinar club, and we will close down the webinar for all of you that have been able to join us. Well, remember, this is recorded and there will be provided and uploaded in several places and spaces. If you have registered for the webinar, you'll receive a copy. If you have not registered for the webinar and you see this recording, please share it with a friend. Thank you all very much, and I appreciate all of our partners for joining us today. Have a wonderful day, everybody.